Decisions 2021. This is the final program of the 8 Great Decisions programs that this World Affairs St. Louis has conducted in 2021. My name is Joel Glassman. I'm the Vice President of World Affairs St. Louis, and I'll be serving as your host today. Before we launch today's program, I want to be certain to thank University of Missouri St. Louis and their international office, UMSL Global, for their sponsorship of this series, both this year and for the past decade. They've been excellent partners, and without their assistance, it would have been difficult for us to bring this program to you. The World Affairs Council of St. Louis is a nonprofit, nonpartisan membership organization that undertakes to bring international programming, international educational programming to the St. Louis audience in order to stimulate interest in and partnerships in and engagement in world affairs learning. The Great Decisions program is a project of the Foreign Policy Association that was founded in 1918. Great Decisions program rests on the basis or the assumption that an informed citizenry is necessary in order to maintain a democratic society. Great Decisions attempts to introduce to audiences all across the United States to the complex foreign policy issues that dominate our time. These Great Decisions programs represent the largest public discussion program about foreign policy issues that's conducted in the United States. These programs have been carried out under the auspices of the Foreign Policy Association since their inception 70 years ago. It's been the privilege of World Affairs St. Louis to be the local host for these programs for the past decade. And we're very pleased that, again, in 2021, we can bring this program to you. Let me briefly summarize today's agenda. It's very similar to the agenda that we've employed for all 8 of our programs. We will show about 5 minutes of a video prepared by the Foreign Policy Association to introduce our topic. That will be followed with a presentation by our guest speaker, Captain William Waitera, for about 30 minutes. His presentation will be followed by a Q&A session of approximately 20 minutes. At the end of the Q&A session, we'll show the balance of the Foreign Policy Association video about today's topic. And now a few words about today's topic. It's great power competition in the melting Arctic, which is, of course, a newly emerging issue in the United States, in the foreign policy arena. This issue has, as you'll see very shortly, national security, economic development, and climate change policy implications. Until recently, this was a region of the world that had declined in importance with the end of the Cold War, but more recently has emerged as a major region of great power competition. When Secretary of Defense Austin testified before the US Senate at his confirmation hearings, he acknowledged the increased significance of this region in national security planning for the United States. We will now be watching a few minutes of the Foreign Policy Association video to further introduce this topic. I'll be back very shortly to introduce our guest speaker.
For all of recorded history, anyone seeking access to the vast, untapped riches of the Arctic has faced one key obstacle: ice. But the frozen North is no longer quite so frozen. As the polar ice cap retreats, the Arctic is becoming a focus for economic development and geopolitical rivalry. Great Decisions investigates the ambitions of Arctic powers, both old and new, and asks whether a spirit of cooperation can endure in one of the Earth's most inhospitable regions. The fight over the melting Arctic. Next on Great Decisions.
Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association in association with Thomson Reuters. Funding for Great Decisions is provided by the Herford Foundation, PricewaterhouseCoopers LLP, and the Nelson B. Delavan Foundation.
The old mariners fought for the Northwest Passage because they believed it would prove a short commercial route between the East and the West. The route which Amundsen has located will be of considerable use to whalers, but it is unlikely that anything else will come of it. National Geographic Magazine, 1906.
By the time the Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen completed the first transit of the Northwest Passage, it was widely understood that Arctic shipping routes offered no commercial value. But now, more than a century later, the Arctic is changing.
In 2019, Anchorage, Alaska experienced the highest recorded temperature in the history of their state. If there's any pretense about us being in denial about climate change, all they have to do is look to Anchorage and understand that it's the honest-to-God truth.
In July of 2020, Arctic sea ice cover hit its lowest ever recorded level. Scientists are predicting in the next decade or so, we may start to see some ice-free summers.
Climate change is going to impact the Arctic and going to impact the conditions of navigation. It could shorten the trip from Asia to Europe. If instead of taking the south route, you could go north along Russia.
In 2016, the Crystal Serenity cruise ship became the largest passenger vessel to sail through the Northwest Passage. It sailed from Vancouver to New York. We're at the beginning of what we can anticipate will be an increase in shipping into the high latitudes.
The melting of Arctic ice is making it easier than ever to access the region's untapped mineral wealth.
Ice melting has both positive and negative consequences. Access to the hydrocarbons and other mineral resources and bioresources in the Arctic is expanding.
13% of the world's undiscovered conventional oil resources reside in the Arctic. 30% of the undiscovered natural gas, nearly $1 trillion worth of minerals, including gold and gem-quality diamonds.
Geopolitical strategists around the world have taken note of the Arctic's new possibilities. Today, many countries are working to expand their influence at the top of the world.
The heightened interest in the Arctic has brought China and Russia together. As Russia and China become more active in the region, the US has realized that it needs to increase its engagement.
The region has become an arena for power and for competition. and the 8 Arctic states must adapt to this new future.
Thank you. It's now my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Captain William Waitera, the commanding officer of the Coast Guard cutter Polar Star, which I think you will eventually see in the video before our program is concluded. It's our nation's sole heavy icebreaker. He and his crew returned from the Coast Guard's first winter Arctic icebreaker deployment in the past 40 years, and they'll soon be setting off on another icebreaking journey. He is a career icebreaker sailor and has spent more than a decade breaking ice at sea, including operations on the Great Lakes, along the coast of Maine, through the Northwest Passage, at the North Pole, and the Ross Sea in Antarctica. He previously managed icebreaking policy at Coast Guard headquarters and completed a 2018 Fulbright scholarship studying icebreakers in Finland. We're very fortunate to have him with us today to help us understand this emerging issue and to present, to enable us to take advantage of his expertise and experience. Captain, welcome and thank you in advance for your presentation.
Absolutely, Joel. It's a distinct pleasure to be here. I'm talking to you today from the CO's cabin on board the Coast Guard cutter Polar Star. We're currently dry docked in Vallejo, California. We're at the Mare Island shipyard where we're undergoing our annual upgrades and repairs that we need to do every single year to keep this nearly 50-year-old ship up and running so that we can provide that presence and access in the Arctic and Antarctic on behalf of the United States. I'll be talking a little bit about the ship specifically as we get on in the talk. But what I'm going to do now is share my screen and just put up a slideshow of some photos from our most recent trip to the Arctic. I'll be talking to some of them specifically, but in general, this is just an opportunity to give you something to look at besides my face. So I'll turn that on right now. Excellent. There we go. So the big question here, and what the video started to touch on, and certainly what the write-up from the book got into, is the strategic importance of the Arctic. Why is the Arctic important now more so than it was 20 or 40 or 60 years ago? And what are those forces that are at play that is leading this discussion and bringing us together here at this juncture to talk about the Arctic and its importance? The number one reason, the thing that underlies everything else we're going to talk about today, is the retreat of sea ice. What used to be a largely frozen domain that was locked off and completely inaccessible except to massively powerful icebreakers and submarines is now opening more and more. Every year, the sea ice is retreating further north, and regular ships of all kinds, government ships, merchant ships, commercial ships, eco-tourists, cruise ships, are all able to access this domain that was previously inaccessible. And so with that increased human maritime activity come a number of factors. The first of which is economically driven, and that's resource exploitation. We're seeing a major push by transnational corporations looking to explore and exploit the oil and gas resources that are found in the Arctic, both ashore and under the seabed. We're seeing a push for mineral exploitation. A lot of these rare earth elements and really valuable types of metals are found in the Arctic, both on land and on the seabed. And then also living marine resources. Fish stocks, largely untouched for as long as humans have been around, are in the Arctic. And the demand for sea-based protein is unmatched. And so there is a push to capture those fish and bring them back to the population centers of the Northern Hemisphere. But it's not just the fish that are already there. Because of the warming sea temperatures, we're seeing the mass migration of species into the Arctic that never used to live there before. Fishing has been banned on the high seas in the Arctic, which is to say outside of territorial limits, until 2035. That ban's been in effect for 4 years, and it was achieved in a consensus fashion by all the Arctic nations and all the major deep sea fishing fleets of the world. However, this is going to be an area where IUU fishing is going to be a concern in the coming decades. IUU fishing is illegal, unreported, and unregulated. These are those high seas fishing fleets that go far, far offshore and are capturing those fish and bringing them home for processing and consumption back in the lower part of the latitude. The other thing that's happening besides resource exploitation in the Arctic is an increase in shipping. Shipping routes through the Arctic, through the Northwest Passage, through the Northern Sea Route on the north side of Russia, as well as potentially in the coming decades on a transpolar route crossing from the Bering Strait over directly to Europe, are more and more viable for more and more of the summer months. The sea ice has retreated sufficiently, and the ice that's there is softer and thinner. And so it's now possible for ships to go through areas that just were not at all reasonable or safe in the past. This is in no way safe now. These areas are uncharted. There's no bathymetric surveys done. We don't know how deep the water is. We don't know where the seamounts are. We don't know where the channels or hazards to navigation are, and they're unmarked. In additionally, the ice presents a very real hazard. The ice is seasonal, much like on the Great Lakes or in the Baltic Sea. It is completely frozen in the winter and then is thawing out in the summer. The ice hazards is variable from year to year and from season to season. One year might be a very light ice year. The next year might be a very heavy ice year, and we cannot yet with any accuracy or fidelity predict which years are going to have a lot of ice and therefore pose danger to the shipping. As time goes on, as the ice becomes lighter and lighter, and that season, that shipping season expands from 1 month to 2 months to 3 months, it's going to become more and more attractive for these shipping companies to put these vessels on those routes because they're significantly shorter, saving 25 or 30% of the transit time through the Arctic so that they can get to their destination faster and make more money. There's a financial incentive for that. The last concern about shipping in the Arctic is the poor response infrastructure. If something goes wrong, and at sea on ships, things go wrong all the time, there's no response. There's no capacity for search and rescue. There's no tugboats, there's no tow services, and there's no repair facilities. If something goes wrong in the Arctic, help might be weeks away and then thousands and thousands of miles to get you back to the place that you need to get the support that you need. The third thing that's happening in the Arctic, besides the resource exploitation and the increased shipping traffic, is foreign government activity. The Russians have reestablished a number of their Cold War military bases in the Arctic, and they're continuing to push forward with a militarization of this previously cold and somewhat sparsely populated domain. They're conducting military exercises, both ashore and at sea, flexing their respective military might in this domain. China built their first domestically produced icebreaker, the Shuilong 2, in 2018. And they have plans for 2 more icebreakers that they're in the design phase of building, including a nuclear icebreaker. China, by the middle of this decade, will be the first country besides Russia to have nuclear icebreakers. There's also a number of new rules and regulations and international agreements that are going into effect or have gone into effect over the past decade that are increasing the demand for the US to be present and to take a leadership role in this arena. The first of which was the 2011 Search and Rescue Agreement that laid out sectors of the Arctic that provided responsibility for the Arctic nations to provide search and rescue services in those sectors. In 2014, the Polar Code went into effect that manages the safety and operation of vessels transiting through the Arctic in terms of the construction of the vessels and what is required in terms of safety equipment and training. In 2013, there was an international agreement that was signed and went into effect concerning oil spills and what the prevention and response to oil spills in ice-covered waters would look like. And lastly, there's a 2017 agreement for scientific cooperation in the Arctic. These are all happening within the auspices of the Arctic Council, which is a consensus-based organization of the 8 Arctic nations. In addition, those same Arctic nations participate in an Arctic Coast Guard Forum, which talks about the practical implementation of the maritime safety, maritime security, and maritime stewardship in the Arctic domain. We're protecting mariners from the sea, and we're protecting the sea from the mariners in terms of the fish stocks and the environmental concerns up there. All of this is just an enormous challenge that we're facing. This is a massive demand for the United States to push and surge our resources and our capabilities into this arena. This is what we're facing. But the question is, where do we stand? And that's unfortunately not a great place. The Coast Guard currently has one heavy icebreaker, the Polar Star, that I'm standing on board today. This ship was built in 1976. It's well past its design service life, and it's old. Like, we are the only capacity that the U.S. has to operate in these ice-covered waters year-round. We're fragile. We have to go to dry dock every year. We spend 4 to 5 months just fixing the ship and replacing all the obsolete parts and systems to keep this one ship, this single point of failure, running. And we have no bench strength. There's no self-rescue capability. If something goes wrong on Polar Star, we are absolutely dependent on Russia or China to come rescue us. That's not a great place to be. The U.S. does have another icebreaker, the Healy. It's a medium-class icebreaker that was built in 2000, and it's been devoted to research in the Arctic for the bulk of that time. But that's it. We have 2 icebreakers compared to Russia's 53. In 1965, the Navy transferred all icebreaking responsibilities to the Coast Guard through an MOU, and that came with the icebreakers that the Navy was operating at that time. We got 8 icebreakers that we took from the Navy. And from that fleet of 8 icebreakers in 1965, we're down to 2. I wish I had some good news for you in terms of where we are today, but it's pretty sparse. The good news is on the horizon. Each of the past 3 administrations in the White House, the Obama administration, the Trump administration, and the Biden administration, have voiced strong support for recapitalizing our icebreaking capabilities and increasing our infrastructure in the Arctic. Congress has appropriated funding, almost $2 billion to build polar security cutters. These are going to be brand new icebreakers. We're expecting the final chunk of that funding in the FY22 budget, but $2 billion to build 3 ships. This is the bare minimum of what the Coast Guard needs and what the United States needs to operate and maintain our safety and security in that region today. If you can imagine, in the next decade, those needs are going to evolve, and there's going to be increased demand for platforms and for our ability to operate and have mission capability in that theater that those 3 are not going to answer. These are going to be good ships, to be sure. They're going to be modern, capable, versatile icebreakers that are multi-mission capable, that are going to be able to go everywhere on the planet any time of year. They're currently under construction at VT Halter Marine down in Pascagoula, Mississippi. The design is complete, and the actual cutting of steel and construction will start in the next couple months. That said, this is going to be the largest, most complex ship the Coast Guard has ever built. It's going to take at least 3 years to finish, and then probably another year to get up and running. Our expectation is the very first one will be available for operations in 2027. Last summer, President Trump acknowledged the importance and highlighted the demand for the U.S. to pay attention to this domain. He issued a presidential memorandum titled Safeguarding National Security in the Arctic and Antarctic Regions, and it demanded a report from the Coast Guard explaining what our needs were and what our vision was to defend this domain in the future. The report came back and had a fleet mix and operational plans that said 3 polar security cutters are not enough. We need 4 polar security cutters, and we need 5 additional yet to be designed medium icebreakers that will be able to provide us with a 2.0 coverage in the Arctic. At any given day of the year, 4 heavy icebreakers and 5 medium icebreakers will enable us to have 2 ships in the Arctic year-round, 365 days. And that might seem like a lot for a domain that we currently are at about a 0.25, generally operating up there only 3 or 4 months a year. But consider that the war on drugs and our Western Hemisphere strategy has us devoting 7.0 coverage in the Eastern Pacific, trying to disrupt the trafficking vectors coming out of Central America, carrying cocaine up to the coast of Mexico. So putting 2.0 in the Arctic is actually a pretty modest investment and the right size to address the threats that we're facing in that theater. So I want to talk just for a few seconds about the last year for Polar Star, because it's been very exciting. Polar Star has been deploying annually to Antarctica. We've been working with the National Science Foundation to establish a channel and turning basin in the Ross Sea, in McMurdo Sound in Antarctica, to provide all the supplies and food and fuel and scientific materials that the U.S. Antarctic program needs to maintain an active and influential program year-round on the Antarctic continent. When the COVID-19 global pandemic happened, the U.S. Antarctic program took a step back and realized they could not afford the risk of bringing anybody onto the continent and introducing the virus to an environment where there's no advanced medical care and transportation options off the continent are severely limited. They canceled all scientific activities, all sea lift activities, and all transportation on and off the continent for the previous summer season down there in the January and February of 2021. This freed up Polar Star to go north, as Joel mentioned, and conduct the first Arctic winter patrol that the U.S. has gone forward with in almost 40 years. And I'll tell you, it was cold. Temperatures went down to negative 25 degrees Celsius, and it was dark. While we were up there, we experienced 10 consecutive days of unrelenting, inky black darkness. There was no sunrise. The ice was thick and hard. And we talked earlier about the ice conditions in the Arctic lessening and retreating. And that is absolutely a summertime condition. In the winter, the Arctic is still a very inhospitable and harsh environment. We experience storms and hurricane force winds and blowing ice. Trying to operate up there is not easy, and particularly in that time of year. We went as far as 72 degrees north, which set a winter Arctic latitude record for ships operating on the surface. I have to assume that submarines have gone further north in other parts of the year, but 72 degrees north today is the farthest north that the U.S. has put a surface ship in the winter months. And while we were there, we also patrolled the maritime boundary line. We asserted our sovereignty on that line with Russia to let them know that we were capable of operating in this theater of operations in the winter months. We also put the Russian fishing fleet on notice that they needed to abide by international norms and regulations and stay on their side of the line. And Russia certainly took notice. We were subjected to daily overflights by the Russian border guard, flying orbits around us in circles, just keeping track of our location and what we were doing. We also received radio calls from the Russian border guard telling us that we were not welcome and that this was their domain. We asserted our sovereignty, and we asserted the right of transit passage through the Bering Strait in accordance with international maritime law. This is what the US has not been able to do because of our really meager icebreaking capacity. The Healy, our other icebreaker that I talked about earlier, is headed north here in a few weeks, and they're going to go through the Northwest Passage this summer for the first time in 15 years. It's a joint operation with the Canadians, again, to continue to build that expertise and partnerships in the Arctic domain so that we will be ready to counter all threats that we face in that region, whether they're natural threats from the environment, whether they're man-made threats from oil spills or search and rescue cases, and so that we'll be able to counter foreign threats, whether they're government-based from the military or government ships of Russia or China, or if they're commercial-based, which is foreign fishing fleets illegally operating in our exclusive economic zone and capturing our fish. That's a basic outline of what's going on in the Arctic and what Polar Star has been doing. I now welcome some questions. I think Joel is going to take them from the chat box. If you have them, please pop them in there now. I'm glad to talk more about the Arctic or the Antarctic or anything else that interests you. Thanks for your time.
Actually, what I'd like is for you to send me the questions, not in the chat box, but in the Q&A box on your Zoom screen. They're more or less public service information in the chat box. But while I wait for the questions to emerge, let me start off by asking a question about China's interest in the Arctic. The Great Decisions briefing book discusses it rather extensively. What's your sense of why China has this interest? Is it primarily military in nature, or is it primarily economic in nature?
I think the motivation is definitely economic. As I talked about the shipping routes and the opportunities to move goods from port to port on more direct and more economical routes, that's an opportunity for China. It definitely threads well into their Belt and Road Initiative, and so they have an interest in that. They also are very interested in sea-based protein, the opportunity to capture fish and bring those home to really try to fill that insatiable demand for food from a gigantic population is an interest of theirs as well. And once that happens, once they are operating in that area with their commercial vessels, with their commercial fishing vessels, now they have a practical and justification to come and surge first their militia ships, and then later their Coast Guard, and potentially future their Navy combatants into that arena and assert control in the region.
We have two questions that are relatively similar. They really address the coordination of the various NATO countries. To what extent do they work together in the Arctic region? To what extent have they failed to combine their efforts or coordinate their efforts?
Absolutely. Much like the US, NATO has been somewhat lagging in our ability to coordinate and align our interests and our activities and our operations in the Arctic. This is starting to change. In 2020, Operation Trident Juncture was led by Norway, and it was a gigantic operation with a huge...
And come in with your video off.
About 30,000 NATO sailors and soldiers operating on vessels from 16 or 17 different countries in the Barents Sea, north of the Arctic Circle. It was an opportunity to test some of our systems and our interoperability in that theater, but also to kind of send a message to China, to Russia, that we were not going to be deterred and that we recognize this is a priority going forward.
I wanted to ask a question about Russia's role. Obviously, they are a very Arctic nation. They have a huge coastline that abuts the Arctic. In the video, and I don't think we've come to it yet, one speaker suggests that their activities are militarily aggressive. Another suggests that their military activities are primarily defensive because they're the ones who are exposed because they have this long coastline. How would you assess the Russian behavior? Is it aggressive or is it defensive in the Arctic region?
You know, I think they would certainly describe it as defensive. That with the melting ice and the changing Arctic environment, their northern flank becomes exposed. And it absolutely makes logical sense for them to build up those defenses to protect that exposed coast. However, in the world of militarization and the military industrial complex and defense facilities, nothing is purely defensive. Anything can be transformed and used in an offensive capability once it's in place.
Okay. One of our audience members is asking for an amplification on your statement that the Coast Guard is operating at 2.0 or 7.5. What exactly does that mean in terms of numbers of ships? Those of us who aren't in the naval defense business might need a little more clarification.
Glad to help. So when we talk about presence of a ship in theater operating, one ship on the water for 365 days is a 1.0 presence. You can think about it the same as a full-time employee, all right? But ships can't spend 365 days at sea. We need to go ashore for maintenance and replenishment. And so you're moving ships in and out of the theater. But at any given time, we have one ship on the water for 365 days, and that would be 1.0. So 2.0 means two ships. But in order to do that with our maintenance schedule and all of our shore leave and everything else that goes into that and the logistics tail, that requires 4 or 5 ships to get 2 ships on the water for 365 days. And then looking south down to the JIATF, Joint Interagency Task Force mission, interrupting the trafficking of drugs through the Eastern Pacific. Imagine that. Even more, 7 ships at any given time are moving around in that theater, trying to disrupt the vectors of cocaine being trafficked through the region.
Okay, one of our audience members asked if any of our NATO allies have any of these icebreaker vessels, or is the U.S. the only NATO country that is able to provide ships of that cost and caliber?
Absolutely. So Canada has a fleet of icebreakers. Finland has a fleet of icebreakers. The Canadian Coast Guard operates their icebreakers, which is a challenge because the Canadian Coast Guard is not a military organization. It's a civilian-based organization. The Canadian Navy just commissioned their first Arctic patrol ship, the Harry DeWolf, and it's going to be the first in a class of 6 patrol ships that will be armed and operated by the Canadian Navy. So they are beginning to make those investments. Finland icebreakers are operated by Arctia, which is a joint public-private partnership. It's purely for economic needs in shipping, supporting winter navigation in the Bay of Bothnia and the Baltic Sea. Finland, the Navy in Finland has a Squadron 2020 concept, and they're in the design phases of building basically frigates that will be ice capable. We look at other nations, specifically in NATO. Denmark and Norway both have naval combatant class vessels that are ice strengthened, but none of these are actual icebreakers. And I think that's the distinction. Icebreakers are designed to operate independently and create channels for other ships to follow behind. Ice-capable ships are able to operate in ice-covered waters without damaging themselves, but they cannot break through flat plate ice and open up a new channel through frozen water.
Okay, the very first statement that you made is that this whole issue takes on a new coloration because of climate change. Without climate change, access to the Arctic remains very, very limited and is not likely to be an international issue. But what kind of negative consequences are there as a result of this climate change? Is it possible that the sea level will rise beyond our ability to navigate the Arctic?
With a warming climate comes melting ice, right? And sea ice that's frozen seawater displaces the exact amount of water that was formed to freeze it. So when sea ice melts, sea levels do not change. The rise in sea levels are coming from the ice sheets that are on land, the glaciers in Alaska and northern Canada, and the ice caps in Greenland and Antarctica, because that ice is not displacing any water. As it melts and flows into the sea as icebergs that then melt, that's what's causing the sea level rise. And that sea level rise threatens not just the Arctic, but low-lying areas throughout the world, because the world's oceans are interconnected. Miami and New Orleans, right, and Amsterdam, and these global cities that are at or below sea level are being put at risk by rising sea levels.
But at the same time, they reveal certain natural resources that become more exploitable because they're no longer under frozen ice.
Exactly right. And so with oil and gas, with some of these mineral resources in the Arctic, they've been trapped under ice for thousands of years. And now for the first time, there's a period of the year where they're under open water. And so much like we see in the Gulf of Mexico with all of the seabed drilling that's going on there, this becomes a viable option in the Arctic. There's also transportation questions. If you look at the Yamal Peninsula in Russia, there's tremendous resources of natural gas up there, but it was inaccessible. There was no way to get it to market. Now, with the retreat of sea ice, they're building ships that are able to transit from the Yamal Peninsula back through the Kara Sea and to Europe and carry that natural gas to market through a transit passage that was never opened previously.
Okay. Let me read this next question to you from one of our audience members. We have recently announced our intention to increase freedom of navigation operations in the Arctic. Do we have sufficient capacity to do this, and will our NATO allies be joining us in this operation?
To answer the first question, absolutely not. With a fleet of 2 icebreakers, which are primarily devoted to Coast Guard missions, right, which is to say search and rescue and law enforcement, we do not currently have the capacity in the US fleet to be carrying out a lot of those national defense, blue water, gray hull Navy missions like freedom of navigation. As the polar security cutters come online, that will certainly become an option. And this is where we do need to rely heavily on those NATO partners. Canada, with the Canadian icebreakers, they're state-run ships, so they're absolutely valid instruments for a freedom of navigation operation. The Royal Navy from the UK absolutely operates ice-capable ships that would be possible to conduct these sorts of operations. Norway, certainly. There's plenty of options, and until we're able to bridge this gap that we currently have, it's going to be contingent on those partners to work together to really assert those rights of freedom of navigation in ice-covered waters.
We have another question from our audience, and I hope this isn't too political for you as an in-service Coast Guard officer. What about the Biden administration? How do you sense their relative interest in the Arctic compared to the previous Trump administration? Will they advance the cause of American Arctic preparedness? Will they slow it down? I mean, do you see a change as the administration has changed?
You know, it's amazing. The common thread over the past 3 administrations has been their enthusiasm and support for increasing our infrastructure in the Arctic. President Biden spoke at the Coast Guard Academy graduation last month and was very clear in his message about the intent of the US government and his administration to build icebreakers and to invest in American security in this region.
What about Congress? Do you sense a high or low level of enthusiasm in Congress for this mission?
You know, with the icebreakers, we are at least a decade late in terms of bringing these platforms to operation. And the Congress has been very supportive. As I mentioned earlier, almost $2 billion of investment to get us those first 3 Polish security cutters. But that's less than half of what we need. We're going to need more. And I'm cautiously optimistic that there will remain support, particularly from the Alaskan delegation and from some of these other appropriators that understand and appreciate the strategic necessity of having an operational capability that's able to assert U.S. sovereignty in this domain.
Another question was whether Congress was well informed about the Arctic. Would you say they are or not?
There are regular briefings and committee hearings talking about these issues. This has been exposed, I think, recently. As Congress, one of the only things that Congress has been able to agree on of late is the threat that China and Russia pose to us. And this dovetails well into that discussion. There is a shared understanding of the need for investment of time, of energy, of resources into our capabilities so that we can keep pace with the investment that's going on overseas so that we don't get left behind.
I think I'm going to ask one last question. Are there any U.S. economic interests in the Arctic that stand out to you?
The same resources that are there in other parts of the Arctic are very much in the U.S. Arctic. Those seabed resources, interestingly, near shore, are pretty easily defined. As you move further offshore, there are resources on the seabed that would notionally be part of a U.S. claim for an extended continental shelf. And the briefing book does a great job of delving into how the Law of the Sea Convention describes the ability to submit claims and assert sovereignty over those resources on the seabed past the 200-mile exclusive economic zone limit. An important part of that, however, is the Law of the Sea Convention has not yet been ratified by the U.S. Congress. That would be an incredibly important first step to controlling those resources and ensuring that we assert our rights over them, is to finally have the Congress ratify the treaty, which the U.S. drafted back in the 80s. The U.S. was the lead party in writing this treaty, and yet it came back, and the Congress, for various reasons, has been unable to come together and ratify it. I think that would be a very important first step into asserting our rights over those resources.
Well, since you raised the issue that the U.S. has not ratified it, can you give us a short answer to the question of why we have not ratified it?
I would hesitate to speak on behalf of congressional leadership that has severe reservations about it. It is a minority of the Congress that has not yet come through with it, and they feel that there are competing demands that lead us not to comply and step in line with the other 191 out of 193 countries that have signed on to this treaty. For all intents and purposes, it has become customary international law at this point. Unfortunately, there are provisions of the treaty that the U.S. will be excluded from by not being a party to it.
Okay, well, Bill, thank you so much. I know all of our audience joins me in thanking you. This is very informative and very comprehensive and gave us all a lot to think about in an area that I would have to acknowledge most Americans, including people who are fairly attentive to world affairs, have not done a lot of thinking about in recent years. We're going to turn back to the video in just a moment, but first I'd like to thank all of you for participating today, and for those who have joined us for all 8 sessions, special thanks to you. The Foreign Policy Speaker Series is intended to empower citizens to understand the critical foreign policy issues, and I think this is a good example of those critical foreign policy issues, and you certainly helped us to understand them better. We will, of course, be back with Great Decisions 2022 next year. We're looking forward to that. And before we end the formal part of today's program and return to the video, I'd like to remind you that World Affairs St. Louis is a membership organization. We would certainly urge you to join. Your membership makes it possible for us to continue the important work of bringing programs like this about critical foreign policy issues to a St. Louis audience. I'm relatively certain that in the not too distant future, these programs will be face-to-face again, as well as online. Thank you, Captain Waitira. You added a lot to today's program, and thanks all to our audience. We'll resume the Foreign Policy Association video directly.
Thanks, Joel. It was a pleasure.
During the Cold War, the Arctic became a battleground as the US and the Soviet Union faced off across the pole.
What was once the impassable Arctic now provides the quickest routes for attack from a wide sector of Europe and Asia.
Geopolitical competition is going to become a more dominant feature of the Arctic. And this is also an area that the United States has somewhat neglected over the past few years.
When we thought the threat of over-the-pole ballistic missile attacks had ended, we were premature in our view that competition in the Arctic had diminished. And I think we will now pay a price for having to hurry to catch up.
Ура!
Президент Российской Федерации Владимир Путин.
Vladimir Putin has quietly worked to strengthen Russia's strategic position in the Arctic to a level not seen since the Cold War.
The Russian president has very clearly explained that one of his main goals for Russia's Arctic policy is to develop the northern sea routes. It would mean upgrading a lot of transport infrastructure, port infrastructure, and so on.
They're not messing around. They understand the value of the Arctic. They're establishing bases and activity up there, natural resource extraction.
They have the most modernized strategic and nuclear submarines very close to Norway, but they have a bigger strategic ambition. And that I would say is mainly the strategic competition between Russia and the United States.
We are strengthening scientific, transport, navigation, and military infrastructure, which will allow us to secure Russia's interests in this strategically important region.
Some experts contend that Russia's military buildup should not be seen as a provocation.
Former Soviet facilities are being opened back up. They're building out additional infrastructure there, modern infrastructure. They're putting in longer runways. But a lot of what I have seen and what I've heard is that it's defensive in orientation.
Well, you
could ask me if I'm concerned, I'm not. I think if that is a threat to anyone, it's a threat to the polar bears primarily. There's a need to have some sort of security presence in that enormous space.
Russia, perpetually strapped for cash, has been forced to turn for help to the newest player in the region, China.
After 2014 and the Western sanctions on Russia following Crimea annexation, Russia had no other choice than to turn toward China and accept Chinese investment. Russia and China are cooperating quite closely on the Yamal liquid natural gas project.
Yamal Peninsula is in the Russian high north. It has a large natural gas reserve, but Russia for a very long time has not had the ability to explore that natural gas because it requires large amount of financial capital.
Although Russia and China have cooperated effectively on oil and gas exploration, experts caution that the two countries' interests in the Arctic do not always align.
On the one hand, China is perceived by Russia as a promising partner in the Arctic. But on the other hand, the Sino-Russian relationship in the Arctic is sort of a marriage of convenience. Russia has no illusions about Chinese interests.
Russia strongly identifies as an Arctic state and would be unwilling to countenance a partnership with China where it's no longer the leader in that region. I think China is mindful of that and has tread cautiously with Russia in the Arctic.
As China has ramped up its investment around the world, the Arctic has become part of its global strategy.
China has integrated the Arctic in its Belt and Road initiative, calling it the Polar Silk Road. And the idea is to build infrastructure to be able to use the region as a shipping route.
The 2018 Arctic White Paper by China states what national interest China sees for itself in the Arctic. Chinese are quite clear that they have an economic interest in the Arctic, and they have interest in the governance issue in the Arctic because the changes in the Arctic region has a global impact.
Chinese companies have sought investment opportunities in every Arctic country. But to local officials wary of China's ambitions, such investment is not always welcome.
China will use the same methods that it has done in the rest of the world to promote a Chinese agenda that is not just about making money, but it's also about establishing a strategic foothold.
China's actions in Greenland have been very controversial. Chinese construction companies bid to renovate 3 airports, and that elicited concern in the United States. And Secretary of State Pompeo approached Denmark to warn them against this.
I think we should pay attention to anything that is a precursor to military presence in the Arctic. Investment in Greenland's airport for tourism, benign. Investment in Greenland's airport where you might ultimately control that as a base, not benign.
For many years, China controversially sought membership in the Arctic Council, an intergovernmental forum for the 8 Arctic countries to discuss common issues. In 2013, China finally earned observer status within the council.
China has successfully got itself into the room of the Arctic Council, but it does not yet have a seat at the table. So that actually has created quite a lot of frustration in China about its Arctic policy.
Many years ago, we kind of had the Arctic to ourselves, but the latest development is that also non-Arctic states are very eager to take part in I think what they see as an Arctic adventure.
One of China's arguments is that because climate change in the Arctic is a threat multiplier. It affects China as well as Arctic states. But Arctic states claim that they are the stewards of the region and other states outside it should play by their rules.
American policymakers have taken an especially dim view of China's interest in the Arctic. In May 2019, at the Arctic Council ministerial meeting, then Secretary of State Mike Pompeo castigated Beijing for its behavior in the region.
There are only Arctic states and non-Arctic states. No third category exists, and claiming otherwise entitles China to exactly nothing.
Being there in the audience in that very speech, it was rather strange. There has been some sort of agreement that this is for functional cooperation. So let's keep it like that.
The criticisms and accusations made by individuals on the American side regarding China's involvement in Arctic affairs are completely inconsistent with the facts. Moreover, they are contrary to the general trend of peaceful cooperation in the Arctic.
Mike Pompeo placed the Arctic in the context of great power competition, which was also unusual for the Arctic Council because the Arctic Council does not deal with security issues.
In Mike Pompeo's defense, anytime you try to ignore reality for collegiality, you'll lose collegiality more permanently. It's very important that we recognize that our challenges with China and our challenges with Russia, we can't pretend they don't exist.
In 2019, an unusual proposal brought the Trump administration's Arctic strategy to the top of the nightly news.
The Wall Street Journal is reporting today that President Donald Trump and his senior advisors have floated the idea of purchasing Greenland. Officials from Greenland, which is an autonomous part of the Kingdom of Denmark, have responded by publicly declaring that their island is not for sale.
Although the plan to buy Greenland was swiftly dismissed, American policymakers are paying more and more attention to the Earth's largest island.
The U.S. has opened a consulate in Nuuk, the capital of Greenland, in May 2020.
It's a statement of America's commitment to the Arctic as non-Arctic states look to exploit the region for their own interests, as I warned of back at the Arctic Council.
The U.S. has also approved of a minor aid package to Greenland. That's for purposes such as economic development, so that Greenland, for example, can start making money on tourism. That was one of the areas where China was interested in investing.
I think a lot of people don't know that we have an air base up in Greenland, the very tip top. I've been there a couple of times. Our facilities in Greenland, they're the pickets. They are the eyes and ears for the U.S., watching for threats coming from the east.
In Alaska, experts are sounding the alarm about the lack of American infrastructure in Arctic waters. The U.S., they say, is not prepared for the coming surge of shipping.
It reminds me of the stories of the early Arctic explorers, many of whom were, of course, rescued by Inuit. We will be, in all likelihood, the first responders because of the lack of infrastructure and availability of response services throughout the Arctic.
We're going to need icebreaker capacity to be available. We're going to need more Coast Guard investment. They need a full base on the western coast of Alaska that's fully operational and available.
In April of 2019, the Navy and Coast Guard awarded a contract to VT Halter Marine for the detailed design and construction of a polar security cutter. When we think about our maritime national security objectives and the need to support economic and commercial and our scientific interests, it's just critical that we begin to field these polar security cutters.
Fundamental to U.S. Arctic policy is the question of how to balance the Arctic's economic potential with global climate concerns.
For security purposes alone, the United States shouldn't be holding back on its oil and gas production capability. What we don't produce, the Saudis will, the Russians will, the Venezuelans will, and I believe it's very important for the United States to be a player in the global energy market.
We've already discovered enough fossil fuel reserves to push us beyond the safe level of warming that was agreed to in the Paris Climate Accords. Opening up new areas like the Arctic is completely inconsistent with limiting climate change to a safe level.
Now, policymakers must decide whether it is wise for the U.S. to spend the billions of dollars that would be required to turn the Arctic into a geopolitical battleground.
It's very expensive, both to build and to maintain. But if the United States is committed to this competition with China and with Russia, and if we believe that the Arctic is a worthwhile domain of that competition, this is the kind of investments that are necessary for us to be able to sustain that kind of intense engagement that's going to be required.
What we need is not competition. What we need is collaboration. It's a lot easier to work on the assumption that competition is inevitable, and therefore to funnel yet more money to the Navy and to the Air Force so that they can undertake this militarization of the Arctic. I think that would be a large mistake.
When the Arctic Council was founded in 1996, its members agreed to use the forum to discuss environmental and cultural issues rather than security.
The Arctic Council has as its primary objective to promote cooperation, coordination and interaction between the Arctic states and the Arctic inhabitants. It is explicitly stated that the Arctic Council is not dealing with military security. It's probably one of the main contributing factors to the Arctic Council being able to continue to operate, I would say, relatively unimpeded.
It has now a heavy emphasis on sort of climate change, environmental issues, practical economic cooperation between the participating states. I don't see that as changing. Security issues, I think, will be fairly difficult to bring into it.
Although the Arctic Council members had long cooperated on environmental issues, climate change became an unprecedented sticking point at the Council's 2019 summit in Finland.
In May 2019, the Arctic Council meeting was the first time that there was not a common declaration that was adopted at the end. And the main reason was that the United States did not want climate change to be mentioned.
We didn't sign today the Arctic Declaration. It is clear that climate issues are different from the different viewpoints and from the different capitals.
Arctic Council ministerial meeting in Rovaniemi, Finland in May 2019 displayed that there are some new challenges. And the indigenous peoples organizations definitely expressed our concerns about that, as climate change is a major concern for us.
Some experts believe that if the Arctic Council is to remain collegial, it may be necessary to find a new forum to encourage dialogue between the US and its strategic rivals.
NATO allies and Russia, they have a body called the NATO-Russia Council. That's where the NATO allies discuss security and defense with Russia, and that should be the base where we continue to discuss these issues.
What we need to do is to be able to meet those nations with military forces up there and talk about confidence building measures. Talk about other ways that we can avoid surprising each other with military deployments. I would use a fora that's not set up yet, but I would use one that is not the Arctic Council.
Because the capitals of all 8 Arctic nations lie below the Arctic Circle, it will be essential for policymakers to listen to those who live in the region.
What I learned at being in the Senate is their inability to understand on the ground what's going on is pretty high. They don't live there. They don't live in a community that's 30 below. If the local communities in the state are not engaged, then it will be, in my view, a long-term disaster for the area.
If one recognizes that every matter in the Arctic region is interrelated, then the issues of security, militarization, stability, and all of the related matters concern us, concern the people who rely upon this environment.
Despite rising geopolitical tensions, the people who live in the Arctic are confident that the connections between neighbors will remain stronger than the forces of division.
Our fear is that if there is an increased militarization of the areas, that the opportunities and the possibilities for us as one people to interact could be affected. But we also put a lot of confidence in the Arctic Council and that body for being an arena for discussion and dialogue between neighbors.
Residents of the Arctic have long shared bonds that transcend national boundaries, forged by the common experience of life in a severe environment. Now, those bonds are being tested as the Earth's great powers turn their attention toward the top of the world.
Great Decisions is America's largest discussion program on global affairs. Discussion groups meet online via Zoom and Google Meets, in person at community centers, libraries, places of worship, and homes across the country to discuss global issues with their community. Participants read the 8-topic briefing book, meet to discuss each topic, and complete a ballot which shares their views with Congress. To start or join a discussion group in your community, visit fpa.org or call 1-800-477-5836. Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association in association with Thomson Reuters. Funding for Great Decisions is provided by the Herford Foundation, PricewaterhouseCoopers LLP, and the Nelson B. Delavan Foundation.